All
right, well, we're live now. Hello, everybody. I'm Erica, and I'm here with one of my professors. This is Stuart Semple, Dr. Semple. So, Stuart, would you like to introduce yourself and kind of tell us a little bit about what we're going to be chatting about today?
Yeah, of course. First of all, thank you very much indeed for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. So, my name is Stuart Semple. I'm a professor of evolutionary anthropology. I'm a primatologist, so I study monkeys and apes, and I've been doing that for 25 years now, all in all. And the one thing that I've been studying all the way through that time, so I've been lucky enough to study a whole range of topics. One thing that I've studied throughout that whole period that I think is the most interesting question you can possibly ask is around monkey communication. How similar or not are the primate languages to our own language? And that's something I've been working on for, all of that kind of 25-year period. So I'll be delighted to talk about it today.
Yeah, absolutely. One, the folks who've been following this channel for a while would be very familiar because I've linked to your paper on Gelada vocalizations and zips and Menzrath's law. And I bring up the Campbell's monkey paper as well. And another one that I'm quite fond of is the, I think it's a 2012 paper on how chimpanzee gestural vocabulary matches with something like 90-ish, 95% with human toddlers, which I thought was very interesting. I think that there seems to be something kind of foundational that appeared very early in the lineage that we belong to. So I try to summarize that paper very often, but it's one of my faves. So I would love it if you would just kind of explain what you did and what you found.
So the Gelada paper, okay, so this is one of the, it's probably the paper I'm most proud of actually on my CV. First of all, let me give you the context. So in human languages, there are these common statistical patterns. They're called linguistic laws. And there are a bunch of them, and we've worked on a few. So one that's very commonly studied is known as Zipf's law of abbreviation. It's really, really simple. It says that more commonly used words are shorter. And if you think about the words you use all the time, at, of, the, he, she, it, they're all little short words, aren't they? It's not very often you use words like anti-disestablishmentarianism, okay? One of the longest words in our vocabulary. You know, if that was the word you used all the time, you're going to run out of breath. You're going to run out of time. And frankly, you know, it's not going to be very efficient. That's Zipf's law of abbreviation. There's another one called Menzrath's law, which says the larger the whole, the smaller the parts. So longer words are made up of shorter syllables, longer sentences are made up of shorter clauses. And these laws are kind of common to not all human languages, but certainly most of them. So they seem to be a kind of hallmark of language, if you like. And in the Gelada paper, we decided to test Menzrath's law. And Geladas live the mountains. Monkeys that live in the mountains of Ethiopia. They live in huge troops, and the males give long vocal sequences of different sounds. And one of my former students, a former student on the MRes course that Erica is just completing now, had collected a huge database, over 1,000 different vocal sequences from Geladas. We analysed those sequences, and we found that just like human languages, they follow Menzrath's law. Longer sequences are made up of shorter calls. One thing that was very interesting was not only were long sequences made up of shorter calls, but longer sequences tend to start off with shorter calls, almost as if, well, you know how long that sequence is going to be by how long the first call is.
Right, right.
Yeah, makes you think the artist might be planning.
Yeah, there's an element of almost like, and it's kind of a tough thing to kind of say, right? But there's almost like an element of like forethought, like, all right, this is the sentence that I'm going to say, this is the call that I'm going to make, and I understand where it's going to start and where it's going to end, which is really interesting because, you know, the consensus in the primatological community seems to be that Geladas aren't known for being like geniuses. You know, they're not known for having like these super, they're constantly passing all the cognitive exams that you pass their way. And yet, even these guys, just chilling out on the Ethiopian highlands, they manage to have these complicated vocal sequences, that follow the root of our own language, which is very interesting. And
it is very interesting. Let me rain a little bit on your parade, which I hate to do, but
oh no, please.
I'll come back to why they're even more interesting in a second. It looks like they might be planning, but we don't think that's what's happening.
Okay.
No more than, for example, if I start off a long sentence, I don't plan that sentence ahead and then think, oh, crikey, this sentence is going to be a really long one, in order that I really ought to start it with a short word in order that I don't run out of breath, because that would be very efficient. I wouldn't be able to get my message across. It's a subconscious thing, right? And actually with these Gelada sequences, what we think is that they're quite long and complex, but actually they don't mean much. It's just a kind of way of being friendly. Yeah,
okay. Yeah.
So, but what we do know is they follow MRes law, so they've got a common structure. You know, at the simple mathematical level, they follow the same law as language. But the really key thing that we showed in this paper, and just to kind of give everybody the kind of credit where it's due, so it's Morgan Gustafson that collected the data and had a large part in doing all the analyses writing the paper. Tori Bergman, who runs the Gelada project and the Simeon Mountains, they're both from the University of Michigan. Morgan's now at the University of Texas, Austin. And then we had a brilliant mathematician. I don't know how he'd describe himself. He's kind of a polymath. He's called Ramon Ferrari-Cancho. He's at University in Barcelona. And he's really brilliant, because what he was able to do was not only help us with the analysis, he's also able to look at MRes law and say what it means, what it reflects. So what does the larger the whole, the smaller parts? What does that actually mean? Why is it important? And what he was able to show is that law comes about because of something called compression. Okay. Erica, you must know what compression is. You've zipped up a file before to email it to somebody.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's taking a large message and making it smaller for the sake of efficiently delivering it.
Yeah, exactly. It's about efficiency of coding. So you can compress information. Every time you send an email, it gets compressed and then it's received at the other end. What Ramon was able to show is that MRes law reflects compression.
Okay.
Now, that's really important, because not only do we see MRes law in my language as I'm speaking today, we see it in Gelada communication, and then we went and had a look at the literature, and there's a bunch of people who work on molecular biology who found it at the level of genes. So genes that have more exons, their exons are smaller. At the level of genomes, so species with a larger number of chromosomes, those chromosomes are smaller. And at the level of proteins that have a larger number of domains, those domains are smaller in size. So now we've got evidence that compression not only underpins our language and Gelada vocal communication, but actually might underpin biological information in its kind of, across all these different levels of life. So that's why it's a paper that I'm really kind of proud of, and it was really exciting working with these brilliant people on that paper.
Yeah, that is superb. I remember, so for context for everybody watching, Stuart did this lecture when I was in the UK, and I loved it then and I love it now. I actually came back because my fiance was living with me at the UK, and I was like trying to explain it to him, and I was like, okay, so it's like it's kind of like this biological foundational truth, if you will, and I'm trying to regurgitate it for him, but I always forget to kind of underscore that idea that it's so, and it's flowery language, but it's foundational to the degree of a genetic level, which is very, very interesting. So one of the papers too that I really found interesting, that you were an author on as well, had to do with group size and vocalization. So I want to kind of pull it up here, or rather, the coevolution of vocal communication in sociality and primates.
Yeah.
So you want to kind of tell us a little bit about that, the relationship between group size and the kind of the type of vocalization that we see? Because there seems to be this relationship between, okay, you live in large groups, you're a social animal, and the need to communicate is extreme, because you have to be able to tell your conspecifics facts about yourself, how your status and things like that, warning about predators and the like.
Yeah, exactly. So this is going back a while. So this is actually, again, credit where it's due. the idea for this study came from my PhD supervisor, who's a fantastic scientist and a fantastic person, Professor Karen McComb, Sussex University. Check her out. She does amazing stuff across all sorts of different domains. Animal cognition, animal communication. And it was actually when I was doing my PhD, so I can remember when this idea first came up. So I was doing my PhD in 1996, if anybody can remember that far back, if any of you were even born then. I know it seems ancient. And Karen and I were actually working together in Kenya, and she mentioned this idea that she came up with, which was, why don't we look at the relationship between group size and repertoire size in primates? Because there's been a big idea out there, that, and a nice idea, that language evolved because our groups got so big, we eventually needed a new way of holding them together. This is kind of Robin Dunbar's kind of grooming gossip and the evolution of language idea. Really nice idea. Yeah, absolutely. So the idea was that primate groups, in order to keep themselves together, they have to groom each other. And as a group gets bigger, you need to spend more and more time grooming, because you need to kind of make friends, influence people. You need to keep your bonds going. Yeah. Eventually you get to a point where you've got such a big group, you can't groom everybody. There's not enough time in the day, basically. We're all pushed for time. Primates are the same. They've got to eat, they've got to drink, they've got to mate, they've got to avoid getting eaten, they've got to socialize, they've got to rest, they've got to do all the bits and pieces.
The days are packed. Exactly,
yeah. They've got a lot on. You might think they just look like they're hanging around. They've got a busy day ahead of them, and they need to pack in the right amount of stuff. So the argument was, as groups get bigger, eventually you run out of grooming time, and then something like language evolves, which is a great idea. But we thought, well, hang on. It's a theory about language that doesn't say anything about vocal communication. All it says is as groups get bigger, grooming time is going to go up. But what about their vocal communication? We know that communication is really important for kind of, mediating relationships. Yeah. Think about your language. What are you using it for? You're using it to keep up with your friends, forge new relationships, reconcile them when they break down. Just kind of, it's everyday stuff. So we thought, well, wouldn't you expect that as group size gets bigger over evolutionary history, not just grooming time goes up, but actually the complexity of their vocal communication system goes up, such that when you hit that point where you've got, you can't do enough grooming to keep your group together, you've already got a really complex vocal system, so you've just got a little step off to make it more complex and you get language.
Right.
So the prediction is really simple. Bigger groups, more complicated communication. And yet no one had actually looked at this. It was quite amazing. So it's like, well, why has nobody looked at it? And as I say, it's Karen's original idea. So she kind of brought me into the project, and I was delighted to be part of it. We kind of teamed up. And we spent years going through the literature, finding out group size and repertoire size for, I think we've got about 45 different species in total.
Right.
It's kind of hard actually to quantify vocal repertoire. People do it different ways. And, the data are a bit patchy, but we're able to get data on repertoire size and group size across these 40 odd primate species. And when you look at it, the story is beautiful, because what you see is that species that live in big groups have complex vocal communication. Species that live in small groups have simple vocal communication, at least as measured by size of the vocal repertoire.
Okay. So what do you, because my first question right when I saw this is I was like, okay, what about gibbons? What about hylobatids? Because they've got these long, complicated calls that they perform in these dyads, right? Some of them do, some of them more than dyads. Why do you think that that's like a phylogenetic, just kind of leftover almost? Or do you suppose that because, these, for those of you who maybe don't know, gibbons are known for their small group sizes. Some of them live in quote unquote monogamous nuclear style families with one male and one female. Some there's a male and a couple of females. They're Southeast Asian primates. And their calls are very complicated when compared to, some other primates, some New World monkeys, and even some of the like guanins and things like that. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Do you know what? I'm going to hold my hands up. We did a bit of not a cop-out, but we couldn't quite work out how to quantify gibbon vocal repertoire size. And we're very open about it in the paper. It's not kind of dishonest at all, but we just say, look, we don't know how to measure gibbon song in a way that's comparable to all the other species. So we didn't include them in the analysis. My suspicion is, and I think some people are working on kind of singing animals, my suspicion is that gibbons have evolved this song as a result of their monogamy and their kind of weird, unusual social system and their territoriality. And I suspect it's kind of over and above what you'd expect from their repertoire normally. I suspect if you took the song out and looked at the rest of their vocalization, their kind of everyday,
it would be rather constrained.
Yeah, it's probably quite small and probably fits in reasonably well with the hypothesis. But there's no doubt these singing apes are problematic for us. But brilliant. I mean, how cool are they? The song is extraordinary.
They're so cool. As kind of a side note for my thesis with regard to sexual dimorphism and trying to quantify, although it's more of a binary, are they aggressive or aren't they aggressive? Is it high or is it low? But trying to look at the relationship between these aggressive females and how dimorphic the canines are. And I found it really interesting because the difference between some of these monogamous or serially monogamous New World primates, like the callitrichids, the marmosets and tamarins and titi monkeys and the like, versus the gibbons, so the hylobatids, and how they're both monomorphic in canine size. So males and females have these similarly sized canines. But for gibbons, there are these big dagger canine teeth for both of the sexes. And for the callitrichids, there are these itty-bitty little stubby guys. And I was talking to Plavkin about it, the guy who gave me the data, for those of you who don't know in the audience. And he was like, it's kind of a weird thing because gibbons are just this weird outlier in so many different categories. Like they just, for whatever reason, they're over there in Southeast Asia, just minding their own business, chilling and doing weird things all the time. Like you've got the big, massive hyoid of the Siamangs where they just have these big frog-like throats that expand outward and they're so loud. But they're just kind of weird. And in looking in kind of like, okay, well, what do we know about the evolution of hylobatids? Like, why did this happen? And we just don't know that much because that area is just so poor for fossilization. So it's just, you've got these little apes over there doing weird stuff. And that's kind of what we know. It's just neat.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the great things about primatology is there's been so much brilliant work done. It tells you that, they do such amazing things, but there's so much you don't know. You know, occasionally an undergraduate or maybe a master's student says something to me like, that was quite regularly, say, well, people have been working on this stuff for 40, 50 years. Don't we know everything? It's like, do you know what? The only thing we know is how much we don't know. And we don't even know whether we know that. There's so much brilliant stuff to do.
So I was talking to Todd, and again, for those of you who may not know, Todd is my advisor for the MRes. And Todd and I were discussing, because I had all this morphologic data for canine tooth size in probably, I think it was something like 132 species. Just really, really good data that on and collected from all these museums. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, okay, so now I've got to correlate this behavioral data with all of these guys. And that number just started shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking on how much we had all of this information for. And finally I said to Todd, I was like, okay, how is it that you've got, this entire genus, like for instance, Alanopithecus. I was like, we've got this whole genus and we don't know anything about them. Why is that? And he goes, where does Alanopithecus live? And I was like, well, like Central Africa. He's like, it lives in the swamp and no one wants to go research in the swamp. That checks out. I was like, I don't want to go to the swamp.
Yeah, no, do you know what? I've very early on in my sort of scientific career, I thought working in nice places is a good way to go. So my very first research project, before as a primatologist, I worked on coral reef ecology in a place called Reunion Island, which, if you don't know it, it's just off Madagascar.
Okay.
It's an awesome place with beautiful coral reefs. And I realized then, do you know what? you can do science in some pretty cool places. And then I realized when I worked in primatology, I know there's kind of almost a macho thing about primatology. A lot of people think you're not a proper primatologist unless you work in some mosquito-ridden swamp. You've had malaria, dengue, bubonic plague, everything you can possibly catch. If you haven't loved it, you haven't done it. It's like, do you know what? That's not for me. I like working with terrestrial primates that live in nice, hospitable places to work. We have a project, Bino Mayolo led it in the Atlas Mountains in Morocco, working with Barbary macaques. It was heaven. There was nothing that wanted to eat you, nothing that wanted to sting you, no disease you were going to catch, and it was great. I know. I think as I get older, I value these things more than ever.
And you know, the positive of that is Barbary macaques are they're cheeky little dudes. They're fun to watch. They're really, really cool primates. And for folks who may not know, they're the only European primate outside of humans. Just barely though, right? They're right there on Gibraltar.
Yeah, that's an introduced population. They were native kind of Europe before that. They're an introduced population in Gibraltar, but they're the only non-human primate that lives north of the Sahara in Africa. And they're the only macaque that doesn't live in Asia.
Yeah.
Weird. And they're kind of weird in all sorts of ways. The males spend a lot of time carrying infants, and they're not their own infants. So they've got a range of really interesting behaviors for sure.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. So when we went to Trentham, which is it's a sanctuary for Barbary macaques in the UK, and as a part of the MRes, they took us to Trentham to observe the Barbary macaques and kind of learn how to do sampling methods for these guys. And it was really funny because when Harry, one of the other program advisors, supervisor now, right? He's the entire program supervisor.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was like, yeah. So normally in a lot of these ground monkeys, these old world monkeys, you can tell who the males and the females are by looking at their butts, or sometimes their teeth, or who's carrying the babies. He's like, but Barbary macaques, not so. Because the males will just scoop up little babies and carry them all day long. And so he's like, you can't always just say, that one's got a baby, that one's a female, because it might be this big hulking male with this itty bitty little baby just hanging out.
Yeah. And they also, those behaviors are, really interesting questions about why they do these babies. So males will carry babies for hours on end, and it seems to come at a cost them. It seems to cost them some energy. But they also use the babies as a kind of social buffer. Right. So let's say I'm a kind of low-ranked adult male, and the big alpha comes over the top of the hill, and I'm thinking, oh shit, I'm going to get beaten up here. What do I do? Oh, baby, hold it here. Because you know what? If you hold the baby, no one beats you up. In macaque society, so often you see them, they'll hold the baby, the other animal will walk past them, they realize they're safe, and literally just drop the baby and walk off.
Yeah. Well, you gotta think this would probably work with humans too. I mean, if I'm about to get my ass kicked and there's like a toddler nearby, if I scoop up that kid, I'm like, hey man, I got a baby. Don't you don't that's okay, fine, sure, whatever you say. Yeah, macaques are really weird about that. And originally my thesis was going to be on pigtailed macaques in Malaysia, and I was going to look at I think sex differences are really interesting in primates. So I was going to look at the differences between how the kind of functional spite works in the males versus in the females. And because of that, I had to figure out, okay, well, I had to learn a lot of stuff about macaques, who's egalitarian, who's despotic, what that range looks like, and why they're like that. And, macaques, some of those macaques are really mean, man. And some of them are just really, really chill. The Tonkin macaques just sit in the Sulawesi Islands and groom each other all day and don't do much else. I mean, and then you've got crab-eating macaques that kick the crap out of each other every opportunity they get. And Barbary macaques consistently seem to land kind of in the middle there. They're pretty chill, but every now and again they'll break out into those big brawls, which we got to see when we were at Trentham. And you kind of just put your hands up because they're free roaming. So you're like, okay, please don't run into me. Please don't bite me. Just let's relax. Keep it cool, guys.
Yeah, and the thing is, when they get into those big fights, I mean, like I say, you read the textbook and they say Barbary macaques are fairly egalitarian, they're fairly peaceful. You know what? that's fairly true most of the time. But particularly in the breeding season, when it really kicks off, you get a lot of competition between the males, and you get massive fights, like seriously big, 8 or 10 males all fighting. And what I noticed while working with them was when they're fighting, they are so absolutely focused on the fight that they will fight around your legs, and you're never in any danger. It's pretty terrifying because, they're screaming away, they've got the teeth out, and there's often blood around. But they're literally just either side of you, kind of batting each other, and they're so focused that you might as well not be there. You're a tree as far as they're concerned. But yeah, they really go for it.
Yeah, they are, man. They're hard to keep track of too once they get into those fights, and it's interesting when you're designing field work. You have to take those kinds of things into account, because when I was, Yulia was my advisor when I was still planning on doing a behavioral project, and she's like, so here's the thing. She's like, if you're gonna be measuring any kind of conflict and you're studying an animal that doesn't live on like an open area, you're gonna have a really hard time figuring out who's directing aggression at whom. Which, I always thought was kind of like, it was kind of like an aha moment, because now whenever I see studies and they're doing something really cool, my first thought is, oh, wow, that's really neat. And then my second thought is, okay, how'd they do it? And how potentially flawed is that methodology? Because it's all fine and good to say, yeah, we tracked aggression and we measured, how it was directed, and, we did continuous sampling and all this stuff. And you're like, okay, but these are like a rainforest living monkey that's sometimes up in the trees and sometimes down on the ground. Like how robust is that really? And sometimes they really surprise you. Sometimes you read their sample size and you're like, damn, that's really good. And then sometimes you're like, oh, maybe it's not as solid as I thought. That was one of the things that was cool.
A story on redirected aggression just kind of triggered a memory, actually. So for those of you that don't know, there's this phenomenon in primate societies, redirected aggression. So basically, there's a hierarchy. So there's a top dog, and then there's, the ones below it. And what will happen is, let's say that, the big alpha male threatens someone below him in the hierarchy. A good way for that animal who's been threatened to cope with that is basically to turn around and threaten someone else. So you're redirecting the aggression, and it's a coping strategy. We've probably all seen it in a working environment, right?
Yeah.
The boss gives you a bollocking, you turn around, give someone else a bollocking. You kind of, it's a redirection. But I always remember I had a real moment when I was working with Barbary macaques in Gibraltar that told me two things: how I was kind of accepted into the group of Barbary macaques I was working with, and where I sat in that group. I saw this beautiful chain of redirected aggression where the big alpha male threatened another adult male, who turned around and threatened a female, who turned around and threatened another female, who threatened a really little juvenile, who turned around and threatened me. I realised, okay, first of all, this is quite good because they kind of accepted me as part of the group. But also, holy shit, I'm right at the bottom of the hierarchy. This little juvenile who was literally that big was like, oh, I could take him, no problem.
Yeah, you got trounced by the juveniles. Oh my God. A magical moment that's also just a touch insulting.
Yeah. And that was 25 years ago. You can see it's like I left an imprint on me.
Yeah. So Celine told me something similar. Celine was a colleague in the program, and she went and did research on the vervets prior to coming to the program. And then she also did her thesis on the vervets. Vervet monkeys being a ground monkey in Africa. There's a bunch of different Chloropithecus, Chlorocebus, yeah. That thank God for groves, because I was trying to figure out, Plavkin collected the data for my thesis back in like 1995, and so a ton of the names have changed. I was going through like, okay, all right, this is this, but actually it's this. Chlorocebus. And she was telling me something very similar. She was like, yeah, it's really funny. She's like, because these fights would break out, and then the little itty bitty juveniles would come and look at Celine and kick dirt up at her and stuff like that. And she was like, okay, I guess I see where I stand.
Yeah. I think it's good to note your place in society.
Yeah.
You're right at the bottom.
To be fair, if if a Barbary macaque charged me, an adult of either sex, I'd be like down the street, like, oh man, I don't want any trouble. They're pretty intimidating.
Yeah. I mean, they're big animals. I mean, the only time, unfortunately, I did get kind of chased by them. Again, this was in Gibraltar when I was working there. They're very habituated there.
That's a wild population.
The wild population kind of up on the top of the rock at Gibraltar, but they're very habituated to people. And I was doing some sound recording, and I was focused on adult females because I was looking at a particular call they give. And I was so focused on a female that I took a step back and, well, there's no nice way of putting it, I trod on a small monkey. Now, fortunately, I only trod on it enough and immediately realized that I obviously, frightened it. Didn't hurt it in any way. It wasn't injured. No monkeys were injured in the making of this anecdote. But it screamed like you wouldn't believe. And that scream had every single monkey in the troop, probably about 50, immediately ran at me. And, I don't know what the advice is. Often people say, if monkeys charge you, you should stand. You know what? I was off. I was gone. Yep. As fast as my little legs could carry me.
Yeah.
I didn't stop running until I got almost halfway home, which is about a mile. It's terrifying.
I would have been so out of there. Because the thing is too is that they're big already, but when they're mad, they puff up and they look about double the size. And they got those big honking teeth, and I'm not keen to mess with that. I'm out of there too. Yeah. I had an experience. It's a very primal thing. In my undergrad I did a stint, a study abroad stint in Tanzania, and we got the pleasure of going to Gombe State National Park and got to see the chimpanzees there. And one of the days, we were walking around in the brush looking for the main group of females that had been spotted in that area that day, and we came across a group of them, and I saw one kind of on the side, and I was like, oh man, like I think I could probably get a closer look. And it was probably an older female, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, but she had an infant. And so I scurried away from the group, and I was like getting real close, and I was like, oh, this is a magical moment. This is very cool. And I was getting such an awesome view of her foraging, and it's, she looked up and we kind of made eye contact, and she kind of like lowly hooted at me. Right. And it was like this very deep primal, I should not be here right now. And she's about to kick my ass if I don't hightail it out of there. And I backed up to a tree and just kind of froze, and every hair on my body was on end, because I was like, okay, this was a huge misstep on my part. This was just not a good idea. I'm in her personal space. She's got an infant, and she's 3 times as strong as me. Fortunately, she just kind of looked at me and kind of moseyed on in the other direction. But it's easy to forget, it's, you get inside this mindset of like, oh, I'm big and nothing's really scared of me. But then it's like you get your ass kicked by pretty much everything out there. So
yeah, exactly.
Not you anyways. There were baboons at that site as well, and I learned very quickly to be afraid of baboons. They are very intimidating animals, and we washed our clothes in the river, or in the lake rather, Lake Tanganyika, which was right. And the workers there were like, listen, you got to stay out there with your stuff, because once you put your stuff on the line, like, baboons are really curious and they might just come up and take it. And I was kind of like, okay, like that, they probably just say that, it's funny, you're trying to scare the students, whatever. But no, they took several things when we were swimming the lake, and they were just gone with them. They were gone, So it was. Yeah,
I remember when I was working, I only had the pleasure of working with baboons once again. It was during my PhD, just for a few months in Kenya. And the advice you get is, you don't look a baboon in the eyes. It's a threat. But the baboons that I was working with were renowned for picking on women.
Really?
Oh yeah. You're told, don't look them in the eyes. Don't look them in the eyes. It's like, okay, got it. I'll do it.
Yeah.
They could tell the difference between male and female researchers.
Yeah.
It was very, very obvious. And it was typically the kind of sub-adults, so let's call them adolescent males. They would freak out the female researchers, because basically what they'd do is you'd be standing working, And then the baboon would walk around and then just look straight in your eyes. So you're like, oh, this is the stuff I'm not going to do. So you turn around and the baboon would come around, sit in front of you and stare you straight in the eyes again. And you know what? A minute or so of that, and it can break you down. It's really, you know, it's
that's the thing, right? I mean, we share so much in common with all of the other primates, but especially old world monkeys, and that kind of entire group of the catarrhines. And it seems like we have this wide range of facial expressions that are shared across us. You know, the furrowing the brows, kind of almost something of a frown, and then raising the eyebrows is like surprise or I'm about to kick your ass, you know. But Molly said the same thing. She worked with the baboons in South Africa, and she said, yeah, if you're a woman, you know, you really have to be assertive, like with your stance even, and have a lot of confidence, because they can pick up on that. And pick on you if you don't.
Yeah, and I had the pleasure of working in a really nice research camp when I was in Kenya, and the woman that ran it never let the camp only be occupied by women. There was always a guy around, typically a Kenyan guy. And then one day, she let both the camp chef and the guy that sort of looked after the rest of the camp go together to town. Ooh. The baboons, by chance, came through camp and just wrecked the place. They clearly worked out, hang on, it's just you. It's only you now. Yes. Not those guys that, you know, normally chuck the rocks and everything. And no matter how much you shout and you throw stuff, they're like, really? No. We're going in that tent. We're going in that tent. Kitchen's over there. We're going to do that. The bins, everything. And just literally walk through and trash the place.
Oh my God. That's the thing too, because I know myself personally, and if baboons are ravaging the camp, like I'm going to the bathroom and locking the door. I'm gonna let them pass.
Yeah.
Oh, man. So okay, so your PhD is in anthropology, yes?
Yeah, well, actually, I was in the Department of Psychology. So my PhD supervisor, Karen McComb, is a professor of animal behavior and cognition, and she made quite an interesting move. When I started the PhD, she was in a Department of Biological Sciences, and then she realized that even though she worked with animals, her interests were much closer to the people that worked in the psychology department. So she got to move from one department to the other. Right. Which is a really brave thing to do. And, you know, it's quite unusual in those days to actually move into a psychology department, be the kind of, you know, the weird animal person working on, you know, elephants in Kenya and red deer in Scotland, when everybody else is, if, you know, they're working on animals, they're working on rats in a lab. Right. So my PhD was actually done in that psychology department. But, you know, primate communication, it's zoology, it's psychology, it's biological evolutionary anthropology. So, you know, it fits in various different places, basically. Yeah. We were talking once, I think it was myself and Kate, and I can't remember what spurred it might have been when Ian Redmond was there that kind of spurred the conversation. But we were all discussing how it's like, you know, in zoology, they warn you a lot about anthropomorphization, and it's like, don't apply human characteristics onto other animals. And we were kind of chatting, and it's kind of an interesting convergence with primatology, because we're, of course, primates, right? And there are things that are almost anthropomorphic without having to apply it. And so the question is, like, where does it begin and end? Where do you draw the line? You read a lot of papers talking about laughter-like behavior, right? Or, you know, where they're very careful about the words that they choose, because they don't want to impose kind of human motivations onto other primates, because we can't possibly know. But there's also a portion of that, I think, that's like, appropriate isn't the word, but it's almost understandable, if that makes sense. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think there's been a bit of a change around, you know, anthropomorphism. I think, you know, I think it's dangerous to assume that if we see a monkey behaving a particular way, that if it was a human, that would mean they're experiencing a particular feeling. Right. If we assume that's definitely the case, I think, that's a dangerous assumption to make. But I think we're generally moving towards now a situation where certain language is more acceptable. The idea that monkeys might have friends, and there could be such a thing as friendship. 30 years ago, when it was all hardcore behaviorism, right. You'd have been absolutely, laughed out of court if you'd used that word. And now it's much more, it's a widely used term in primatology. We talk about it, and we're very careful how we define it, and that's important. But we're not shying away from these terms. But I think it's important still to, be critical and avoid anthropomorphism, but equally don't go so far the other way that you're denying things where the weight of evidence indicates these things might be the case.
Right, like a happy medium of clearly defining your terms, but also, like, I think friendship is a great example, right? It's like, so long as you're like, okay, friendship means this when we're considering baboons, whatever. That you can kind of get away with it, because that also kind of, like, what else would you call it almost, right? Like a friend-like behavior, a differentiated social bond. It's like, I think you're tying yourself up in knots with those things. I mean, emotions is another interesting one. I think people are pretty happy now. Most people are happy with the idea that animals have some form of emotion. We're not saying they have human emotions. Why would a chimpanzee have human emotions any more than we'd have chimpanzee emotions? Right.
And we don't know what that emotion might feel like to a chimpanzee, but I don't know what, if you tell me you're happy, you got, great news this morning, you're happy. I sort of think I know what your feeling of happiness is, but I'm only guessing, because I know what my happiness feels like. I'm thinking, well, probably feels about the same for Eric. But that's the kind of, we won't have access to that kind of inner private world of these animals, but we can measure their behavior, we can measure their physiology, we can measure their cognition in ways that help us triangulate on the fact maybe their emotional lives are pretty similar to ours. And we're not saying they've got, happiness the same way that we mean those terms in humans, but we can still make some, some statements about that. And I think, we don't need to be too reticent about it.
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the things that kind of blew my mind, it felt intuitive, but it blew my mind nevertheless. I don't know the specifics of it. I'm remembering it kind of vaguely, but this idea of like understanding mutual facial expressions. And they were testing, I believe it was chimpanzees and macaques, on recognizing human facial expressions. And they just were horrible at it, awful at it, in comparison to, say, a human toddler, for instance. But then when they tested them with members of their own species, they excelled. I mean, it was instant. It was instantaneous. They were experts. Of course they would be, because we were testing them. Like, I wouldn't be able to recognize the majority of the intricacies of chimpanzee emotion. But in this conversation that we're having, a twitch of the lip or slight rise of the eyebrow, and we can recognize generally, okay, well, what does that mean within the context of our own species? It's like, it's the same with other animals. And it's kind of funny because we start to, I did a video quite some time ago on the domestication of dogs from wolves and within our species, how that they're the first species that we really domesticated, and how far we've kind of come with that, and how we've kind of co-evolved in many different ways together. To the degree that they raise their eyebrows and we communicate with slight facial expressions in a way that we don't do with pretty much any other animal. Which is awesome. It's so cool. Yeah. And I think there's something too going on with, the puppy dog eyes. It's like, that means we can see the whites of their sclera, right? Which is a very human thing, because we're big on gaze following. And I don't know. I think that's just so neat. It almost seems unintentional at times.
Yeah. And I think, that I don't know if you've read the paper. So it was Julianne Kaminsky from the University of Portland. Yeah. This kind of, they've evolved this ability to raise an eyebrow. And let's face, you see a dog doing that, it's irresistible. You have to be inhuman not to respond to that. The thing I think is really interesting is there's a few people now, and it's something I'm going to try and get into as well, because I've always thought it's fascinating, looking at human, non-human animal communication. So there was a brilliant paper, that dog one's absolutely fantastic. There was also a really nice one, and I think the researcher's name is Humphrey. I can't remember. Another researcher at Sussex, and what they realized was you can communicate with your cat by slow blinking.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so slow blinking is a sign of kind of affiliation and kind of mutual communication. And if you slow blink at your cat, then it makes it nice and relaxed, and it makes more likely to want to interact with it. This is awesome stuff, right?
Yeah.
So this idea that you can study communication between species, I think is brilliant. It hasn't really been looked at enough, in my opinion. I think we've now got a bit of a handle on how some animals communicate.
Right.
We've got a pretty good handle on how humans communicate, more about language than gestures. Maybe, I don't know, it's not my area. But I think how they communicate with each other, there's loads of really good stuff there. And I think that cat study was a good example, because I remember it came out and it was all over the media, and pretty much every cat owner said, yeah, right, I've been doing that for years. Yeah. Have you not been doing that with your cat? It's like, people probably know I think the most interesting thing actually is maybe they've been communicating with their cat and don't know it. Maybe they have been kind of, just kind of communicating subconsciously. Because that's too. And, it's great stuff. There's so much stuff to do with that kind of, between species communication that, there's another lifetime of research.
So Emily's original project before COVID and everything, that was kind of what she was looking at. If memory serves, she was looking at how vervets respond to startling alarm calls, which
absolutely.
Yeah, because it's then it's this idea that they understand that means the birds are scared. A certain call from the starlings means the birds are scared, so the monkeys are appropriately like, okay, shit, maybe we should be scared too.
Exactly.
Which is just super interesting. Like how I feel like there's probably a massive deficit of research just in multiple different species of this kind of mutualistic communication.
And there's also, there's actually quite a bias. So there's quite a lot, not a lot, but there's a reasonable amount of studies of interspecific communication. But by far the majority, I think, is about deception. So one species deceiving another.
Right.
The classic example is there's a bird called the drongo, lives in Africa. They give alarm calls that cause meerkats to run away. So they'll wait, for example, for a meerkat to dig up a nice juicy scorpion and then give this alarm call. All the meerkats run away and they scoot down and then nick the scorpion. It's kind of, it's kind of crying wolf, basically. It's a bird that cries wolf. And the really interesting thing is you can only get away with it for so long. If you do it too often, you get ignored. So there's kind of an arms race going on with, it's like, if you're a meerkat and you ignore an alarm call, you might get eaten. But if the alarm calls are always false, you become skeptical.
Right. There was something similar done with vervets, if memory serves, about how, younger juvenile vervets will make these alarm calls to get all the other vervets to bail so that they can get the best food. But if you do it too many times, you start getting beat up by your conspecifics, or they start ignoring you, and then you reap the consequences of those actions, which is, it's kind of neat. There's, as I told you on email, I argue a lot. Unfortunately, young Earth creationism is a thing here in the States, and I argue with them a lot about a lot of different things. But very frequently, there's this idea of like, the human morality on this pinnacle where it's like, this is unique, wholly unique. And I find that I'm very dubious about that as a whole, because you see morals appear on this kind of gradient throughout the animal kingdom. And yeah, humans do some stuff that's unique. That's totally true. But all you have to see is one instance of a monkey beating the crap out of the other one for lying, quote unquote. And you start to see how all of the morals that humans kind of exhibit are for social cohesion, which is intuitive for a social living species. Of course, they're for social cohesion. We do horribly on our own. We're inherently group living species, which I don't know. I think that's kind of an interesting one. It seems like it feels like it's always presented as like this gotcha, but it's like, it doesn't seem that complicated,
Yeah, there's good examples of, what we might think of as kind of proto-morality in animal societies. There's great work done on kind of consolation and empathy, taking another's kind of mental viewpoint. I think there's some fantastic work done on that now. Punishment of dishonesty. There's a study in recent macaques, I think, where if you find a big pile of really desirable food, you're expected to give it a food call to bring the others in. Now, if you give a food call and the others arrive, you can eat some of that food. If a more dominant animal arrives and you're sitting on the food and you haven't given a food call, you pay the price. So it's almost like a social contract there. It's like, if you find the food, you give a call. And if you don't, well, you might get away with it. But if you get caught, then you're going to be in trouble. Yeah,
it's funny that you made. I'm imagining it's probably corvids that are doing that, right? Ravens and crows and such.
Yeah, I mean, there's fantastic work done on corvids. There was a beautiful study by a researcher called Jesse Adriense, might be pronouncing it wrong, looking at kind of emotional contagion. So it's a great study. So it might be crows, might be a different species. I'm never that good on details, my memory these days. One bird, and that bird watches another bird have a disappointing experience. So, it can't access some food or some food's taken away from it. The bird that watched the bird have the negative experience has a negative emotional state. So it basically becomes pessimistic about the world around it. And you can test that with this thing called the judgment bias test. It's like, amazing, right? These birds are, if you like, catching the emotion of another individual. So that individual losing its food doesn't really affect them. It's like, if I saw you and you said, oh no, this thing happened. Oh no, I feel bad now. Like, that's the same thing.
That's really, really interesting. I listened to a lecture by Robert Sapolsky, and he had this idea that, okay, the majority of things we just share, right, with all other animals. And then there's a smaller pool of things that we share but do slightly differently. We tweak, we put a spin on it, And then there's an itty bitty teeny tiny pool of things that humans do that are unique from other animals. But every animal has that pool of things that they do that's unique from other animals. And he mentioned in the things that humans do that's unique is that we feel empathy to an extreme degree. We empathize to the degree that we empathize with people that have been dead for thousands of years, or fictional characters, right? So it's really interesting that you can present a bird, right, with someone else experiencing something that's a bummer, and then they get bummed out, because that kind of almost blurs that uniqueness a bit, right? That's really, really cool. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, it was a study that came out, I think, 2019. I can send you a copy of it afterwards. It'd be it's just a great study. Yeah. I think Jessie's going to be doing some great work in the future. She's already produced that study. I know she's got another paper under review at the moment. Really, really interesting. And again, it's kind of chipping away, isn't it? I mean, we spoke about this during the MRes, Erica. Humans are unique. So is every other species.
Yep.
You might say, well, human language is unique. So, well, it's only unique in its being human language. Other animals have components of language. They don't have the language we have, but why would they? We don't have the language they have. And we can certainly argue for certain parts of our language being uniquely complex. But then, you're not saying it's unique. You're saying, well, it's unique in this particular way. So, well, you kind of, it's not a black and white thing. It's much more grey, I think. And that's increasingly, as we study more about animals, as we learn more about how they communicate, their mental lives, their feelings, their emotions, what their social life is like, then it kind of, I think it's really useful to kind of blur those boundaries a little bit. Yeah,
there's, and I find it very romantic. There's this very romantic aspect of this gradient of behavior that exists in the animal kingdom. And we're just closing that gap more and more every year as we figure out more and more about, as you said, the inner lives of other species and how they behave and how they feel, and these secret lives that they lead, which is just really cool. How do you feel? Speaking of language, because I titled this video, primate vocalization and the evolution of language. How do you feel about that front of research, figuring out the evolution of language as we know it? Do you think that there's a set hominin that kind of popped up, or do you think it was just more than that?
It's such a difficult question. I mean, I think there's some really exciting research going on. Language is really tricky, isn't it? Because it doesn't fossilize.
Right.
If we could only get a fossilized language, then we'll be able to see how it's changed over time. So the best we can do is kind of look back through time, and there's some really interesting stuff that's being done now. For example, kind of reconstructing the vocal tract and the kind of the hearing apparatus of Neanderthals, for example, suggesting they probably had speech capacities not so different from our own, auditory capacities not so different from our own. In terms of looking kind of further back, the best we've got is looking at the non-human primates. So, what we see from their communication. I think there was a lot more excitement about this probably 30 years ago. People were starting to see, wow, these monkeys seem to have different sounds for different objects. So maybe they have words, maybe they're putting them into sentences.
Right.
There's been some great work suggesting the animals do have kind of sounds that refer to different objects. Some species seem to be putting those sounds together to make new sounds, make new meanings, but it's pretty limited.
Right.
And in some ways, that's not such a big surprise. If you're a chimpanzee, you're not going to get an evolutionary benefit from reflecting on philosophy or recounting something that happened 10 years ago.
Right.
Life is about getting through each day. It's about keeping your friends, avoiding being eaten by a leopard, getting enough food, and mating and raising your children. That's it. So why would we, if we don't need a language that's as innate and complex as our own, why would we expect chimpanzees to have it?
Right.
So I think there's some really great stuff going on. But I think for me, it's more now about how fantastic is the language of each of those species in itself, rather than how disappointing is it that a chimpanzee doesn't have a language that's like ours.
Right.
And in some ways, I think it's interesting to close that gap, but in some ways it's a bit kind of, we call it anthropocentric. Like, why compare everything to us? Why not compare them to each other? Or over to them, for example. So in the linguistic law stuff I've been doing, people often say to me, well, okay, Formosan macaques follow Zipf's law of abbreviation. The more frequently used calls are shorter. What does that tell us about language? Well, I say, well, what tells us about language is really simple. It follows the same law as Formosan macaques, as these other monkeys. Actually, language is quite simple. We've got, a few flourishes on top, things like syntax and grammar and all those fantastically complicated things. But actually, at its heart, it's just like monkey communication. It follows the same basic laws. Yeah. So there's lots of really good stuff out there.
Yeah, the other paper that you mentioned in the lecture for the MRes was the Campbell's monkey study on the syntax that they present in their own vocalizations, and how syntax can emerge if it's beneficial for that individual species to add kind of qualifiers to words, if you will, which is really cool.
Yeah, so it's a little species of monkeys seem to have kind of 6 different loud calls, which is a bit boring vocal repertoire, really. Even a squirrel monkey can muster 30 odd. But then they seem to be putting these things together to refer to different objects or events in their environment. I think that study was particularly good because what it suggested is that monkeys that have quite simple vocal communication potentially might be doing something much more complex because of what they're doing with that simple system. So putting different calls together to make new meanings. And that might mean that, maybe actually primates are communicating in a more complex way than we imagine. We just haven't worked out the right way to listen to it, the right way to decode it. And that, these are not simple questions to answer, not simple things to achieve. But again, there's a wealth of stuff out there that we can be looking at.
Yeah, things don't evolve to be easily deciphered by humans. That's not the end game there, right? It'd be nice if it was, but it was not to be. Well, this
and I think, what we've got to overcome is, it's almost impossible to listen to sounds and not try and interpret them as a language. Kind of divorcing yourself from that language processing. So I think, kind of trying to be in the mind of the monkey, thinking about, what's the evolutionary setting? What's the ecological setting here? How is that animal evolved in that environment? What should its vocal communication be doing? And then let's see how it might or might not be doing that thing.
Right. Yeah. Well, this has been a superb chat so far. I've really enjoyed it. Would you be willing to answer a couple of questions from everyone?
Fire away.
All right. These guys are asking you some tough ones. We've had about 70 concurrent viewers for most of this, which is pretty good. People are interested. That UK time. Most people were like, okay, like 11:30 as a premiere. Like, what is this time? And I was like, listen, it's the Brits, man. You guys are always doing things wacky over there.
It's always the Brits, isn't it? Now you've got Harry and Meghan. You think you rule the world again.
That's the American way. Scott asks you, what is the evidence that primates, have thoughts and emotions? Do they have a mind?
Brilliant question. So what we can do is we can kind of probe that. So I'll stick with emotions. The way you can get a handle on that is by looking at how humans experience emotions and then seeing if primates have the same sort of thing. So we know that, for example, when humans are stressed, they show certain behaviors. One of the classics is what's called self-directed behavior. It's when you do that, you probably noticed, look, Erica's doing it now. When you touch your face, when you do this, when you fiddle, you twist your watch or you play with your pen, which is what I always do when I'm nervous. Self-directed behavior. Monkeys do it too. And it fits because they do it in situations you'd expect them to be nervous.
Yeah.
You can measure their physiology. Yes, you can measure their hormones to see if they have peaks in this hormone called glucocorticoid, cortisol. And you can even measure, and this is a really neat one, you can measure whether monkeys are optimistic or pessimistic. So you can measure how, in terms of how they're processing the world around them. Just to kind of give you a very, very quick overview, basically you can train monkeys that this sound means a reward and this sound means no reward, and they respond to the reward sound regularly. And then you play a sound in the middle and you're basically asking them, is your cup half full or half empty?
Right.
What do you think this will work out well or better? Yeah. And you can see that when monkeys are, in a stress situation, they interpret the world in a negative way. So we can kind of triangulate in, try and kind of get as close as we can to see what sort of mental lives they might be having.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about the tone test, kind of. It's like, okay, here's the tone. What do you think is going to happen? And then their cortisol levels, I think it would be cortisol, yes, that you would say, okay, what do you expect to happen? Do you think it's going to be a good thing? You think you're going to get a reward, or is it going to be nothing?
Exactly.
Which is awesome. T.D. Lane asks, do you think that cetacean communications qualify as a language?
They qualify as cetacean language. It sounds like a real kind of duck out from me, but they've got really complex stuff going on in cetacean communication for sure. The marine mammals have got really interesting stuff going on. They seem to have syntax, so there's a hierarchical structure in their communication. Is it human language? No. Is it cetacean language? Absolutely, but it's not as complex as our language, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on. If you're interested in following this up more, there's a load of stuff on humpback whale communication. So the reason there's a lot of brilliant stuff on humpback whale communication is people, various organizations, including NASA and the Templeton Foundation, have funded work on humpback whale communication because they want to know what aliens will sound like when they arrive on Earth. And a good way of doing that, they think, and I don't disagree with them, is to work out, well, what's a kind of an alien life form on Earth? And if we can work out how they're communicating, maybe that's how aliens will be communicating if they're communicating. So humpback whales do have an extraordinary communication system. It's got elements of our language, but it's not the same as our language. But it's beautiful and fantastic.
It's interesting too, because you've got these social mammals, which humans and other primates being social mammals, there's an analogy there, right, to be had. But they're living and communicating and just basically leading their lives in this completely different medium of the water, right? So it's like, okay, take a social mammal and stick them in a completely new environment, where even the transmission of sound is different. What's that going to look like? So that's very creative that they would think that. I think, the astrobiology stuff is really interesting, where they're like, okay, well, what's the range of habitability just as the very basis of life on Earth, and then they kind of project that outwards. But even then, it's like it doesn't necessarily have to fall in that range.
No.
It's just that's the minimum as far as we understand it, which is very
neat. Well, just to follow up on that, so I won't take time for too many questions, but one of the arguments we've made is that if you want to be listening out for messages from outer space, so if there's intelligent life out there and they're trying to communicate, and we've got all these telescopes kind of listening out.
Right.
We don't know what form the message will take. We don't know what medium the message will be in. But our argument is, if it's coming from outer space and it's successfully reached us and it's a sign of intelligent alien life, it'll show one trait: compression.
Yeah.
If you're intelligent, you'll compress the message to send it out, and if it's going to get here successfully, it will show compression. So it'll follow linguistic laws.
Yeah. That checks out. You'll at least see some compression, right? Like it doesn't have to be to the degree that we do it, or it may be to a much greater degree than we display it, right? But it has to be on some level. It's a sign of efficiency. That's wild. All right, the next one comes from Amur Ape. It's a super chat, actually. They say they're late to the party, and maybe it's already mentioned, but any syntax in non-human animals? For me, syntax is the essence of language. So.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So this little species of monkey, the Campbell's monkeys, have what is known as proto-syntax. There's another monkey, the putty-nosed monkey, that has something similar. It's the simplest form of syntax. For example, by adding one call in front of another, you change the meaning of the second call. So I think there's one call. Yeah, it's kind of so one's an alarm call, but if you put a boom in front of it, it kind of lowers the intensity of the message. So it's like, don't worry too much, but there's a predator over there. So adding calls together to produce a new sound. Is it syntax? Is it the complicated language that we use? No, but it does meet kind of those simple levels of proto-syntax that we might be thinking of. But I mean, I'd always caveat all this stuff with, that's the best that we know at the moment. Gibbon song we were talking about earlier, it's very, very complicated. We don't know what level of syntax and understanding and meaning might be in there. It's incredibly hard to access that. So just because we haven't found evidence for it yet, doesn't mean it's not there.
It's quite interesting too that, because Campbell's monkeys, they're guinins, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, so Campbell's monkeys are, guinins aren't exactly known for their cognition. They're not known to be like these genius monkeys. They're not dumb for, dumb, quote unquote, but they're not, geniuses in the sense that humans tend to be like, look at the cognition of these particular primates. It's incredible. So it feels a bit telling that in Campbell's monkeys, we're finding proto-syntax. It's obviously there's a hesitation there, but it almost seems like a discovery waiting to happen to define syntax and what it looks like in other primates. Maybe it doesn't look the same, but perhaps it's present.
Yeah, and I wonder if, and this is just kind of a vague idea, I wonder if, the emergence of things at the beginning of syntax, maybe we're not surprised they're happening in small monkeys.
Right.
A lot of these calls are about predators and about danger.
Right.
And if evolution is acting on these vocal communication systems, making them really good at communicating about predators is going to be favoured. So, you know, maybe it's these little monkeys that really live life on the edge that, you know, around every corner from every branch above could come death. Maybe it's that that's, you know, driving these more complicated communication systems. Yeah,
an enormous benefit whenever it emerges, right? To be able to send and receive, you know, messages that are specific, because obviously there's a massive benefit to be able to long-term, without seeing the individual receiving it, to say, hey, listen, it's coming from above or it's coming from below. Like, this is a sky predator, so everyone go to the ground, or this is a land predator, so everybody can go up the trees. That seems like an auto select, right? If should it appear, have it appear.
Yeah, being able to modify messages. You know, if every time you say leopard, everybody panics, and yet the leopard's 200 meters away, it's not very efficient. If you're able to modify that message, it's like, don't panic, everyone, but there's a leopard. Then you know that's going to be an advantage. So I can see why that could be the case. You know, there's nothing more evolutionarily urgent, perhaps, than not getting eaten by a leopard if you're a monkey in the
huge benefits. Forest. Yeah, huge benefits. Yeah. Okay, the next one comes from Dapper Dino. He says, is there any evidence of phonotactics among non-human primate communication systems?
That's a good question, and I don't know what phonotaxis is. So do you know what? I'm going to Google it.
He's our resident linguist, so I don't know what it is either.
Phonotaxis. So just approaching the sound of calling. I'm hoping I'm getting that right. A very quick Google search, which is my default, is it's what I do all the time. Get quite asked questions in lectures, like, oh, I'll answer that in a second. Just give me a second. Phonotaxis. So calls attracting other individuals. Yes, we've got some good examples of that. So one of the subjects, one of the things I studied during my PhD was a thing called female copulation calls. These are calls that females give not during mating, but after mating is finished.
Right.
And what my experiments and studies showed was evidence that females are calling to let males in the group know that they're fertile and they're mating, and it attracts males towards them such that they end up mating with the strongest males in the environment. Right. So it's a female call, much like in frogs where we get phonotaxis. It's a female call that attracts the males. In frogs, it's kind of the other way around, but in primates, these copulation calls do seem to attract other animals.
Huh. Oh, neat. Awesome. Okay, the next one comes from Scott Duke. This is an interesting one. Scott Duke asks, have there been any emotions identified in non-human primates that humans do not have? I don't know how you would quantify it. Like, I don't know how you would identify it.
Yeah, that's a really great question. The reason I like doing these sort of things is you get asked questions that you'd never think of yourself. And that's a fantastic question. The simple answer is we haven't identified emotions that primates have and that we don't. But the caveat is I can't imagine anybody looking for emotions that we have, looking for emotions except for the ones that we have. And this shows you that risk, doesn't it? We're assuming, okay, what are our emotions? Okay, happiness, sadness, frustration, etc., etc. Right, let's go and look to see if other animals experience those.
Yeah.
We don't know what their animal emotions might be. You know, maybe they have emotions that are completely different to ours, and we wouldn't know because we're not looking for them. I think it's a fascinating question. Yeah, and I could only give a very evasive answer. But yeah, a really cracking question. I'll be really interested to know.
Yeah, that would be. Yeah, I imagine too, if we, being humans, I imagine if we identified it, we would put it in the context of, oh, this is proto-greed or something like that. It's like we put it in the context of something that is suboptimal to what we have rather than identifying it on its own terms, which is freaking classic. But Dapper Dino wanted to qualify. It may have been my mistake. We were talking about phonotaxis. He was talking about phonotactics, which is rules regarding which may be sequential in certain situations. Okay. So it was my mistake. I guess I slurred my words a little. Still early here.
So if this is about kind of the rules that govern kind of how things are put together, yes, absolutely. The Campbell's monkey is an example. So they combine calls together, but they have to be in certain orders in order to be meaningful. And I think gibbons also have alarm calls that combine different call types. And it's only if they're in the right order that it has that particular meaning. So if you jumble up the order and play them, they don't mean anything.
They don't recognize it. It sounds like gibberish.
Yeah, so yes, there's preliminary evidence for that sort of thing. Again, these vocal sequences that primates are producing, we're only just starting to work out how we can kind of interpret them. Wouldn't surprise me if there were quite complex rules going on there.
Yeah. Okay, this one will be the last one because I think this is a good one to end on. I'm curious to your thoughts as well. Nestle20 says, I just came in, perhaps this was already mentioned, there are apes learning sign language such as Coco the gorilla, and I've seen that some of these examples are highly disputed. Any comments?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question to end on. I think we've learned some interesting things from great apes doing sign language.
Right.
I think what we've learned is that they don't have a very complicated way of communication. So there's some classic examples. Sometimes the longest sequences that are produced, maybe 12 sequences, and then you look at them and you think, well, what's that chimpanzee actually saying with its signs? And what the chimpanzee is saying is, feed me, feed me, feed me, feed me, orange, 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 feed.
Yeah.
It's a long sentence, but it's not saying a lot, is it? Right. And I think one of the other things is you've got to be very careful how we interpret those sign languages, because there was a really important study. So people had studied one of the sign language chimps, I can't remember which one it was now, and they interpreted all the signs. And then someone said, well, have you got someone who actually is a deaf person who uses this sign language to interpret them? And they got someone in, and that person just said, they're not making any signs here, nothing that makes any sense to me. I don't know what you're seeing, but I'm a native sign language speaker, and this means nothing to me at all. So
yeah, I one of the things that I thought was really interesting is the leap in rigor, so to speak, between someone like teaching sign language like ASL versus using like a lexicon, like with, I think Kanzi was the one who did the lexicon. Yeah. And it was interesting because some of the stuff that they did with him was, for reference, and lexicon, yes, not lexigram. Yeah, lexicon. So it's essentially the screen, for those of you who don't know, with a ton of different symbols on it, and symbols mean something very specific. So Kanzi could type out different sequences with these different symbols to ask questions or, communicate, kind of like sign language, but more objective, so to speak. And something that I thought was really interesting is that when they were working with Kanzi, they could ask him to, they put him in these environments with a ton of different objects, and they would ask him to interact with these objects. So they'd be like, put the pine needles in the refrigerator. And he could do that. And they could say, put the pine needles and the blueberries in the refrigerator, and then he would stumble. So it was additives on the end that became complicated. The simple tasks he could do every single time very well and seemed to understand the significance, quote unquote, of every single symbol. But asking him to order things, right? Like he could maybe put the pine needles and the blueberries in blueberries first. It like the grammar started to kind of trip him up in the order and things like that, which is really interesting. I think what you were saying earlier makes a lot of sense in that context, right? It's like, okay, you don't really need to know the order of things necessarily in the wild. It's like simple things like, hey, let's go over here and then we'll do this. We'll get there, we'll do it, which is
and also I think, I think with all those sign language great ape projects with Kanzi, who kind of touches the symbols, some of those things are impressive. But always kind of the analogy always uses, does that mean they've got complex communication? No, that means after a huge amount of training and being raised in the human environment, they can be taught effectively to do these things. I can train a dog to walk on two legs. It doesn't mean dogs are bipedal. It just means with a lot of training and reward, you can eventually get a dog to walk on two legs. So, if you're interested in how these animals communicate, for me, it should be about how these animals communicate in their natural environment, the environment in which they evolved. to which they are beautifully adapted, to which their communication is beautifully adapted, that's where we should be studying it in the main for me.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, and I think that's a great point to end it on, because I totally agree. I think that there's this concept of human exceptionalism and applying everything in the sense of how we understand it, how we would do it, how we prefer it, and there's something lost there, I think, when we try to put a round peg into a square hole and then say that the square. We're forcing it into that light, and like you said, these animals evolved to given environments. To truly understand, evolve the traits that they did, understanding it in that context is key, because what is evolution if not adapting to the environment? So I think that this has been great. Everyone's loved it. We've climbed in viewers up to around 70, and we've hovered there this entire time, which means people have just really enjoyed it. So thank you so much. Do you have anything you want to say, words or anything like that, before we kind of end the broadcast?
No, I just want to thank you, Erica, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to see you, and real pleasure to be part of this. And thank you to everybody that's listened. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for your interest in primatology. I think if everybody's interested in primatology, the world's going to be a great place.
Yeah, if only we could win everyone over. If we could get everyone on the one thing, finally, at long last, we would achieve perfection. That's civilization we live in. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast. Thanks so much for being here.